This is Ted Bundy. He killed well over 30 people in America in a 4-year period, 1974 and 1978. Roundly considered as one of the most famous psychopaths to have ever lived. What makes a psychopath is their total lack of empathy. They simply can't associate with other people's emotions like ordinary human beings do. This is what makes them capable of committing murder. And interestingly, that's what also makes psychopaths the perfect executives for today's modern capitalist world. 3 traits that they often display is that they often crave validation and recognition from others. They tend to be very self-centered and have high levels of entitlement. They're narcissists. And studies have shown that as many as 2 in 5 executives on major companies display psychopathic tendencies. But you don't have to kill people to be a psychopath. In fact, you can be a psychopath without having to kill anybody, which is why they found many psychopaths in executive positions in major companies. The key trait is to not have empathy for other people, and that can be very useful when you're trying to make tough decisions in a boardroom. In fact, Ted Bundy was a jolly nice person when he wasn't murdering people. He got married and his wife never knew about his murders. With that in mind, it leads quite nicely into our poem My Last Duchess, in which the Poetic Persona appears to be a psychopath before the term was really understood. And as such, we can view this as a poem about the abuse of power and of conflict and relationships more generally. Guys, so we're going to take a look at My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. After the title, it says Ferrara. It's based on the Duke of Ferrara, who was a real individual. His name was Alfonso II d'Estate in Italy around the 16th century, and he was strongly suspected of having killed his wife through poisoning. And the motivation for this was because she wasn't as high class as he was. So this is a narrative poem. It tells the story of how the Duke of Ferrara killed his wife. And really the narrative starts before the poem begins proper. The Duke of Ferrara is the poetic persona. He does most of the talking. It's a dramatic monologue. And he's talking to an interlocutor, someone who has come to visit the Duke as a representative of another man who wants the Duke of Ferrara to marry his daughter. So the Duke of Ferrara is now single because his last Duchess is dead. There's another Duke with another daughter, so he sends a representative to talk to the Duke about arranging a marriage. So we can imagine, for example, the Duke walking around with this representative, and then he stops. He stops in front of a painting of his ex-wife, and he says, "That's my last Duchess," painted on the wall. And thus begins his dramatic monologue talking about his last Duchess. He talks about who painted the picture, Fran Pandolf. He also says that mostly people don't understand the picture very well, and so they have to turn to myself to explain it. He talks about people asking a spot of joy on the Duchess's cheek, alluding to a slight rosiness in her cheeks, and he says, well, that wasn't the husband that put it there, but that rosiness in her cheek, that spot of maybe embarrassment, causes him to recall all the problems he had, in his eyes, with his wife. He said that she was too soon made glad. In other words, she became happy too easily impressed by things, suggesting that perhaps she wasn't that smart. She spoke to other men, she thanked them, good, but he didn't like the way that she spoke to other men. It was an insult to him, perhaps an insult to his 900 years old name, that perhaps he should have had more respect for being a duke. He wonders perhaps he should have lessoned her, in other words, taught her how to behave. But he feels that that's stooping, that's bringing himself down from his high level to educate her on how to behave. And he says he chooses never to stoop. He never actually says he killed her, but there's suggestions for it. I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together, followed quickly by, there she stands, as if alive. Having recounted the story, he then returns to the business dealing with the interlocutor, talking about the interlocutor's employer, the Count. He mentions the dowry he'll receive if he marries the Count's daughter, and finally returns to talk about a bronze statue of Neptune, without any more thought to his dead wife. In the past, this poem has often appeared in collections of poems to do with power. And so one of the themes of this poem is ultimately about power and the abuse of power, particularly in relationships. But this idea of abuse of power can be extended to other things in the real world. For example, think of the way Mr. Burling abuses his power as an employer of several hundred women. He really does look down on them and doesn't really care about them, and doesn't seem to care when Eva Smith is dead. So a simple poem like this can be extended to other things in the real world. The other big theme is a commentary about love and how marriage is supposed to be about love, but this one clearly isn't. It's not real love at all. And so also it can link into the broader theme of relationships and how this is an example of a very bad relationship. Just briefly thinking of some of the other poems, for example, like Piano, that's about a relationship with a mother, and that's very positive. Hide and Seek, that's about a relationship with your friends and how it's upsetting when you lose them. Or Poem at 39, which is about the relationship with a father, that's also positive. And this one's clearly negative. So let's crack on with what we can say about the form. It's a narrative poem. It tells a story. Like a lot of the other poems, there's a narrative element to them. Take a look at Hide and Seek, for example. And like Hide and Seek, it also has a pretty bad ending. The poetic persona is the Duke himself, Duke of Ferrara. So the poem is told in the first person, and that is to indicate the selfishness in this relationship, the selfishness of his power. The poem is also called a dramatic monologue. Monologue means single speaker, and it's a dramatic monologue to indicate, again, his selfishness, just like it being in the first person. And it reveals that he's speaking with an interlocutor, like some of the other poems. For example, Search for My Tongue. But I chose the word engaging because I get the sense that the interlocutor doesn't really say very much at all. It's the Duke that does all the talking. A fact that's also revealed by the unbroken stanza that Browning has used here and the use of enjambment. You just can't interrupt this Duke. His dramatic monologue, he's constantly talking, and that suggests his egoism and his dominant behaviour in his relationships with others, not only his wife but also with this interlocutor. Now, I've mentioned before that form and structure often go together. So in this dramatic monologue, we have these examples of enjambment, caesura, one long unbroken stanza. It's in a monologue. And these are all elements of its form, but they're structural points as well. But one structural point that stands out is, despite all of that, it comes in rhyming couplets. This element of control reveals a kind of sinister control that's matched by the savage and emotionless murder of his wife. I mean, he alludes to that murder of his wife. He doesn't state it out loud. He says, looking as if she were alive, wink, wink. There's also a suggestion that he strangled her, particularly when he says the line, that half flush that dies along her throat. You've got the verb dies there, which is a bit of a strange word to pick when you're trying to say that that kind of redness to the skin was fading away. You wouldn't say it's dying, you would say it's fading. And also, you tend not to talk about people's throats, unless it's for a medical reason or some sort of violent reason. You'd say people's necks, but he says her throat. And so there's this strong suggestion that he had her strangled. That control is also mimicked by the fact that it's all in iambic pentameter, well, more or less anyway.